Hi everyone. My talk will be on interoperability, data harvesting, and aggregators. I will first talk about metadata interoperability, which makes data harvesting possible via an aggregator. So what would be required to create a wide, cross-institutional discovery system for finding aids, especially when finding aids come in various metadata schemes? First, before we can harvest and aggregate our finding aids, we have to first make sure that we can share our metadata. And that requires something called interoperability. The word interoperability refers to the basic ability of different computerized products or systems to readily connect and exchange information with one another without any restrictions. For example, interoperability allows for the unrestricted sharing of resources between different computer platforms through software and hardware without effort through your local area networks or over your wide area networks over the internet. This is called syntactic interoperability, two or more systems able to communicate and exchange data. When I say semantic interoperability, it means computer systems having the ability to not only exchange data, that is unambiguous, but also has meaning. So it's not just the packaging of the data, the syntax, but also the meaning of the data, semantics. Semantic interoperability, where data is exchanged between two or more systems that is understandable to each other. So what happens when you're talking about metadata interoperability? To achieve metadata interoperability, we're saying we have to find a way for different schemas to understand or talk to each other so that they can be harvested and aggregated. Now, here are three examples of different metadata schemas. This is taken from Ellings and Wabel's paper, Metadata for All, Descriptive Standards and Metadata Sharing Across Libraries, Archives, and Museums. Now, these standards were created as material specific to show that these standards are not limited to one particular community, represented here, museum, library, archives. The data structure is the metadata scheme. So you can see right off the bat, these are three different kinds. CDWA for categories for the description of works of art. We got MARC, machine readable cataloging. We got EAD, encoded archival description. I believe Dublin Core is also in the format EAD. I believe Past Perfect uses Dublin Core. The data context, that's the next line. That's the standards or rules that you would use to fill out your metadata fields. Those are the standards and rules that you're going to use to fill out those metadata fields. The data format is how the information is encoded. And this is important because you'll notice they're all encoded in XML. CDWA, MARC, and EAD uses that. So once you go there, you then go to the last part, and that's the data exchange. That's the protocol that allows us to share the collection of records. So all three use Open Archives Initiative, the OAI, for metadata harvesting protocols. And these were developed to work with encoded collections in XML. And that is what makes data harvesting possible for aggregators. So we got that, but these are three different metadata fields. And so for the aggregator to be able to aggregate or harvest data from all these different fields, somehow we have to get these schemas to communicate with each other. And we do that through crosswalks. So what is a crosswalk between different metadata schemas? Metadata crosswalks are a way of mapping the relationships between the different elements of each schema. So a schema crosswalk is set like in a table, and it maps those elements in one schema to the equivalent elements in another schema, like connecting the dots, sort of. If you say this, you mean that. So here are elements and values that have been translated from one schema, MARC records, to another schema, Dublin Core. So you see the MARC fields for title, the 130, 240, 245, and 246 all relate to the Dublin Core element title. I'm going to show you 4 metadata schemas here. It's just some subsets from it. What does this mean when you see 4 different metadata schemas that have been crosswalked? Well, it means that if you have your finding aids in EAD and somebody else has their finding aids as a mark, okay, or even Dublin Core, that you can keep them the way they are. You don't have to change your metadata record into some new metadata record. It can stay the way it is because it has been crosswalked. So these crosswalks are like taking the Tower of Babel of languages, what are you talking about, and makes it understandable to the aggregating software. So we've established interoperability, allowing for data harvesting by aggregators. Now, let's talk about aggregators. So first, the basic definition for aggregation in context to our talk today is the process of gathering various metadata schemes that have been crosswalked to make them interoperable and then harvest that data based on specific standards and present that data in a summarized, understandable, and usable format. Aggregators, software engineers will write software, aggregators that can go out now and grab all this metadata. I'm not going to talk about that part because I'm not a software engineer, but the aggregators are now in a position to be developed and can go out and find all this wonderful metadata, all these various metadatas in a way that it makes sense to them. There are 2 kinds of proprietary software aggregators, closed source code aggregators and open source code aggregators. The closed source, or what sometimes is referred to as non-free software, is a software whose source code is guarded and cannot be modified. That means the software's publisher retains intellectual property rights or the copyright of the source code. And this kind of proprietary software imposes restrictions on what we can do with that software. Open source aggregators refers to software whose source code is freely available on the internet and can be used and modified to fit the needs of your organization. And I believe open source aggregators allow for flexibility to modify source code to meet the needs of our institutions and our users. Here are some examples of aggregators. Now, the first one is a statewide aggregator. This is the Rhode Island Archival and Manuscript Collections Online. It's a gateway to archival collections at Brown University and repositories across the state of Rhode Island. So this is something that is similar to what we are talking about here. Here the finding aids are made available through the discovery system as well as where that collection is at. The next one is more like a meta aggregator. This is the history of medicine finding aids. And these are finding aids aggregated from many states, and it's topical medicine. The discovery tool provides keyword search services across the union catalog of finding aids, describing archival collections. It's got right now, it looks like over 11,000 finding aids from more than 100 institutions. It also aggregates from other consortiums. So this is a consortium of consortiums, hence the metadata consortium, metadata aggregator of consortiums. I do want to point out Archive Grid. Now, Archive Grid is something that was created by OCLC in 2006, and it was discontinued in 2012. But it's an interesting example of an aggregator that was able to aggregate WorldCat, which is MARC records. But it also allowed for institutions to contribute PDF, EAD, or HTML records. So although it has been discontinued, it's still a usable database. And I think we have like 9 Maine institutions that is in the Archive Grid. So we know that to improve discoverability in cultural heritage records, in our case, we're talking about finding aids, the typical approach is metadata aggregations and crosswalking those schemes so that the aggregator can go out and harvest that data. But there are other ways to aggregate archival records. I mean, technology is growing so fast, and the web is just has a billion of linked data, that there is research now looking at taking advantage of metadata from the web using a new scheme called schema.org, which is a vocabulary for the web and linked data. And it has a potential of creating some really innovative ways of metadata aggregation for cultural institutions. I'm just putting that out there because we have talked about this idea of aggregating our collections for an awful long time, but look how far we have come, and maybe it's time to talk again about this. I'm going to stop right here and go back to Susie Bach about our research interests on the Unified Discovery System of Finding Aids and the survey that we put together, because we are interested in knowing what type of platform or software your institution is using, and what metadata fields you think should be or could be shared in regards to your finding aids. So take it to you, Susie.